Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to bring you my April wrap-up. There was a lot going on in April, but it was a really great month overall. April was Autism Acceptance Month. It was also the Disability Readathon and Tome Topple. It was so many different things, and I read at least one book for all of those things I just mentioned, and so many more, so let's just get into it. The first book I finished in April was my arc of Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the sequel to Black Sun, and it was kindly sent to me by Saga Press. It did officially release on April 19th, and I will focus on the synopsis from the first book so as not to spoil the series. This indigenous-inspired fantasy trilogy is set in a reimagined pre-Columbian America, and the story begins with all eyes on the holy city of Tova, where the winter solstice is going to coincide with a very rare solar eclipse. This celestial event, known as the Convergence, has been foretold as the undoing and unbalancing of the world, and the story begins with a mysterious stranger embarking on a journey to Tova, believing that his destiny is to unleash a reckoning at the hour of convergence. Content warnings for some instances of death, murder, and human sacrifice, graphic violence, some instances of cutting for blood magic, brief instances of misgendering, and some sexual content. Because it's a sequel, I'm going to try to keep this brief, but this was definitely a solid second installment. It does have quite a different feel because the first book has that ticking time bomb convention where everything's counting down to this really disastrous event. Because of that, I think the first book has a bit more urgency, which this one slightly lacks, but I think it makes up for that with a lot of introspection and character development. I might have mentioned this when I talked about Black Sun, but I think Rebecca Roanhorse does such a great job of crafting all these different perspectives that all feel pivotal to some degree. I would gladly read from any of these perspectives because each character's voice is very grounded and immediate. Personally, I also did not need a refresher on what happened in the first book, which is something I always worry about, and I think that's really a testament to Roanhorse's world building, the fact that I could very easily remember these distinctive scenes from the first book and inherently understand how they fit into this second book. By and far, the most compelling part of the sequel is how it continues the commentary on cycles of violence, and whether exacting revenge is actually accountability or just planting another seed for future violence. There's a lot of fascinating mythology in this series about the new gods and the old gods, and there are characters who are basically acting as avatars for both sides, and there's such a great exploration of the toll that takes and whether those mantles are something those characters can put down in order to pursue their own beliefs and dreams. And that ties back into that concept of cyclical violence, where it's like, am I fighting for myself, or am I just fighting someone else's battle that I didn't even start? And how do we define where those things converge and diverge? It was a bit of a slow boil for me, but I was always invested from the very first page, and I think the emotional payoff in the second book is incredibly powerful, especially in hindsight. At times it does kind of feel like this is mostly set up for book 3, but I do still think this installment serves a distinct purpose. I enjoyed it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then for both the Disability Readathon and the NB Book Club, I finally got a chance to listen to Lake Lore by A.M. Macklemore, read by Avi Roque and Vico Ortiz. This is A.M. Macklemore's latest queer Latina magical realism story, and it follows 2 non-binary characters, Bastian and Lore, who live in this lakeside town and who are the only 2 people who know about this magical, mysterious world beneath the lake. Shortly after Bastian and Lore meet, the lines between their world and the world beneath the lake begin to blur, and the lake begins rising to the surface, bleeding into their everyday lives and bringing all their secrets with it. Content warnings for instances of bullying, ableism, racism, and violence, as well as references to physical assault. A quick note on the representation: as I said, the story is about 2 non-binary Latina characters. One is more genderqueer, gender fluid, and the other is more transmasc, and they are starting HRT. And also both characters are neurodivergent. Bastian has ADHD, and Lore is dyslexic. Also, in case you missed it, I just want to point out again that this audiobook is narrated by 2 all-star narrators. Avi Roque, perhaps best known for a little book called Cemetery Boys, and Vico Ortiz, aka Jim, in Our Flag Means Death. If you're someone who needs like stellar narrators to want to pick up an audiobook, this is the one. This is the one. On a personal note, listening to this story was almost a healing spiritual experience for me, because not only is the story about 2 non-binary Latina people learning how to love each other and themselves, but then those words were coming to me from 2 incredible non-binary Latina people, and it was just a really powerful experience. I have read literally every book A.M. Macklemore has ever written, and I think this might just be one of their best. It's one of those incredibly rare stories that can pull off the fact that the plot is pretty much just the trajectory of the character's emotions, and it's very much a treatise on mental health and how people navigate ableism that's both internal and external, as well as the emotional toll those experiences can take. Like I said, Bastian has ADHD and Lore is dyslexic. They both function very differently, they have very different needs, and their brains work very differently, and those differences have often been villainized or devalued by the people around them. The story very realistically approaches how exhausting it is to constantly be overlooked or forced into neurotypical defaults that just don't work. And there's a duality in how the story understands that it's both beautiful and lonely that both these characters have to create and imagine their own way of living each and every day. Two things can be true at once. There's something incredibly powerful about these characters forging their own paths and existing as resistance, but there's also something heartbreaking about a world that doesn't make space for you to exist. That can create a sense of isolation, which both these characters definitely feel when the story begins, but they also start finally being able to recognize the beauty in their differences once they finally connect. The most prominent idea in this story is the commentary on how when we discuss mental health and disability especially, we often create this very stark dichotomy of good days and bad days. That's not to say there aren't such things as good days and bad days, but the implication that good experiences and bad experiences can only exist as separate from one another can be really damaging. That idea comes up over and over again in the story, especially with Bastian, who as a coping mechanism will channel his negative feelings or experiences or shame into making these alebrijes, which he then releases into the lake. His thought process is that he's removing those negative feelings from his sight, and he will put them somewhere where no one else can see them or find them, and that will somehow absolve him of this internalized guilt. But that's part of why the lake is starting to come to the surface and interrupt their daily lives, because we cannot simply hide our feelings and our problems away where they can't find us. When we try to compartmentalize the difficult parts of our lives or the parts of ourselves that are not so easy to understand, it often doesn't work, because those feelings will still bubble up and find us. In fact, it's not until Bastian and Laure confront those feelings and accept them as a viable part of themselves just as much as the beautiful, wondrous, powerful, visible, easy to digest parts of themselves that they can finally heal and move towards a better place. This is just such a quietly dynamic story about finding power and identity in the things we've been taught to feel ashamed of or even hate about ourselves, and how those things don't define or negate our beauty and vice versa. There's simply too many good things to say about this, so I'm just going to cut myself off there, but there are so many things about this story that make it an absolutely unforgettable reading experience, and I gave it 5 stars. Then, because my library hold came through, I finally picked up Icebreaker by A.L. Graziadei. This is a queer sports book about Mickey James III, an Italian-American hockey player whose father and grandfather famously attended the same university he's currently going to, and he also is heavily favored to go directly into the NHL as a first draft pick. As you can imagine, that's a lot of pressure to deal with, and not only is he strongly questioning whether being a professional hockey player is actually his own dream, but he's also dealing with his depression and anxiety, which are being aggravated by all of this stress. As if that wasn't bad enough, his biggest rival and threat to his first draft spot, Jason, is actually his teammate, and not only are they grappling with some potential attraction, but they're also trying to figure out how to not kill each other on and off the ice. Content warnings for some descriptions of violence, sports injury, and blood, brief mention of outing, some descriptions of depressive episodes, anxiety, disassociation, and mild suicide ideation, some underage drinking and drug use, and fade to black sexual content. This was one of my most anticipated queer sports releases, and it definitely did not disappoint. The rivals to lovers aspect of this story especially was really gratifying to read, because I think these characters really do graduate to romance from a genuine place of hate. Like when the book begins, these characters are nearly coming to blows on the ice. They're really giving each other hell, and they very strongly resent each other because they're both projecting what they themselves lack onto what the other person has. Jason feels that Mickey is super privileged and entitled and basically taking up space because of his family legacy, not because he has actual talent, and Mickey is envious of Jason because he's bigger and stronger and more confident, and he doesn't have to contend with those same pressures. So there's a lot of genuine animosity going on between them that makes it really hard for them to even be teammates, and then you layer on the fact that they're also begrudgingly attracted to each other, and it creates this dynamic that's both unpredictable and electric. I also appreciate how this story makes space for really important discussions regarding the intersection of both mental health and queerness in sports, especially in hockey, which can be a very aggressive, macho, potentially toxic space. The story really shows these characters trying to break down those barriers and express more vulnerability, uncertainty, and even softness to their friends and teammates. Not doing so is definitely a big contributor to Mickey's depression, especially because the experience of it makes him want to isolate himself, but realizing that his teammates care about him as a person and not just a sports icon makes a really big difference. And I think most prominently the story is really about the importance of finding your own path and asking yourself who you really are and what you really want, especially when you can't extract your own dreams from somebody else's. Those are definitely conversations worth having with yourself. Like, do I want the things I want because I have been told to want them and because they've been deemed acceptable for me, or do I need to quiet the rest of the world and start chasing something different? So overall, I really enjoyed this. It has a really great cast of supporting characters, a dynamic romance, and I think it does a really great job of balancing character development and really great sports content. There was a lot of trauma from Mickey's childhood that connects with his father especially that I did not feel was satisfactorily addressed by the end, and I found the ending itself to be a little bit rushed, but I still gave this a solid 4 stars. Then I made some space to read one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that was Ellen Outside the Lines by A.J. Sass. A.J. Sass is a non-binary Jewish autistic author, and this contemporary middle grade story is about Ellen, who is also autistic, Jewish, queer, and gender questioning as she embarks on a school field trip to Barcelona with her friends. Ellen is someone who really feels comforted by planning everything out, having a clear schedule, and categorizing things in very clear ways. Going into this trip, she's pretty much researched itineraries and schedules from past iterations of this trip so she can very clearly set her expectations. She's also been looking forward to this trip as a chance to reconnect with her best friend Laurel, who's been feeling very distant. However, when they land in Barcelona, her teacher announces that they're doing things differently and making the trip into one big scavenger hunt, and then Ellen and Laurel get put into different teams. Content warnings for some experienced ableism, brief exploration of outing, and some descriptions of overstimulation and autistic burnout. This book brings me so much joy because it's just a love letter to the spirit of adventure, self-discovery, and carving out space for yourself to grow. First of all, the fact that this story follows a school trip abroad makes it really fun and exciting to read because the reader gets to really experience the beauty of Spain just by witnessing Ellen and her classmates going on this epic scavenger hunt. And again, there's a kind of duality to the experience because on the one hand, Ellen is taking in this incredible country and learning about its art and its history, but it's also a lot to process at once. She's inhabiting a new place with a new routine, she's being completely immersed in a different language, and she's also having to navigate these new friendships with people who don't really understand how she works and functions. As I said in the synopsis, Ellen is someone who makes sense of the world by planning things out, fitting things into categories, and scheduling everything that happens ahead of time so that she doesn't have to factor in surprises. It gives her a sense of control, and now she's being thrust into an environment where things can't be easily predicted. Not even the people around her can be easily predicted, because one of the kids in her group is a new student named Issa who is non-binary and who by definition doesn't fit into any of these clear-cut categories. So even though these new experiences and ideas can be challenging for Ellen, that doesn't mean they're insurmountable. And that's one of the things I loved about getting to see her make new friends, because they show her what teamwork really means. When you're in a team, that means you don't have to handle everything yourself. You don't have to know everything or do everything perfectly, because when you can do something, you step up to do it, and when you can't, you step back so that someone else can. It's really beautiful and gratifying to see Ellen discovering this new support system of people who see her and care about her and don't expect her to make herself small in any sense. As I said, these new obstacles can definitely be challenging, especially as Ellen tries to avoid autistic burnout and overstimulation, but she never has to face them alone. Whether it's her family, her faith, her journal, or even a new group chat, she has parts of her life that make her feel safe and grounded, which gives her the strength to take on all of those changes. And I just love how this story is really a testament to becoming comfortable with discomfort. As I keep saying, Ellen prefers the world to be laid out in this very orderly way so she can make sense of it, which can be helpful when it's possible for her to do that, but the world is often not a very orderly place. Life comes at you fast, and change is a normal and constant part of life, and a big part of this trip for Ellen is learning to acclimate to that change in a way that personally makes sense. But she's also learning that it's okay to not have all the answers, either about the world or about herself. What A.J. Sass does so brilliantly in all of their books is giving the characters space to marvel in self-discovery and to be okay with questioning themselves and the world around them, even if those questions don't yield clear-cut answers. A.J. Sass is so generous in the way they give young readers permission to explore all the question marks of life and to learn that you don't need to know everything about yourself or about the world around you in order to find or experience happiness. This is such a soft, tender, heartfelt, adventurous story that's so much fun to read. A.J. Sass has only further solidified themselves as an auto-read author for me, and this was definitely a new favorite. I gave it 5 stars. Speaking of A.J. Sass, I picked up this next book from my library on their recommendation in the comments of my queer sports video, and that was Kenzie Kickstarts a Team by Kit Rosewater, illustrated by Sophie Escobas. This is a queer middle-grade sports story about best friends Kenzie and Shelley who have always dreamed of becoming derby superstars, and with the introduction of a new junior league in their town, they might might just get their chance. The problem is they're kind of the dynamic duo and they always planned on trying out together so they could be on the same team. However, the tryouts are for individuals only or for teams of 5, which would put them 3 players short. So the story is basically about them trying to recruit 3 more people by any means necessary, and not only does Kenzie start getting jealous when Shelly befriends a few of their potential teammates, but she also kind of freaks out when Shelly invites Kenzie's neighbor to join the team, who also happens to be Kenzie's secret crush. This was so delightful. It's a lower middle grade book that has a ton of really great illustrations to accompany the story, and I thought it was just such a fun reading experience. The characters are at a really great age where they're trying to solidify themselves and their friendships, and where it feels like every minor inconvenience is the end of the world, and I thought it was really interesting to see them try to balance all of these changes. That's sort of the overarching theme of the story, using roller derby as a metaphor, because roller derby is a fast-paced sport, it's unpredictable, and control of the game can completely switch at a moment's notice, and the players have to be able to quickly adapt. Kenzie and her friends have to learn how to roll with the punches, which is not easy to do, and that definitely translates to other areas of their life outside the rink. I also appreciate that storyline of Kenzie being insecure about her friendship with Shelly and being afraid that if they go from being a team of 2 to being a team of 5, everything's gonna change. But I love how the story shows that you can have more than one best friend, and in fact making new friends actually means you have so much more love and joy to bring other people and not less. The casual queerness in this story was also fantastic. There's just an inkling of Kenzie coming to terms with the fact that she might have a crush on the girl next door, and also it's very casually shown that her dad is trans. It's a great start to a series, super fun and sweet. I really enjoyed it, and I'll definitely be looking into reading the other books for my library once they have them in stock. I gave this 4.5 stars. On a very different note, I then read a book that would absolutely ruin me, and that was my arc of A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. This was sent to me by Grand Central Publishing, and it comes out on May 24th. It's a queer historical second chance romance with a trans woman as the main character and romantic heroine. Can we just take a second and really let that sink in? The story follows Viola, who went off to war with her best friend, the Duke of Gracewood, and when she was presumed dead after battle, she sees that as a chance to finally escape, transition, and live her life as the woman she's always known herself to be. Many years later, she hears about the Duke of Gracewood having fallen into depression, despair, and grief after losing his best friend, and she basically hears about this because his younger sister wrote a letter to Viola's sister-in-law voicing her concerns for her brother and also her own happiness. So Viola's sister-in-law comes up with this scheme to go visit Gracewood under the guise of helping his younger sister debut in society and begin her season, but really it's a chance for Viola to reconnect with her first love and best friend. Content warnings for some internalized ableism, descriptions of PTSD and chronic pain, instances of deadnaming and misgendering in the past tense, some references to dysphoria, brief mentions of suicide ideation, some exploration of drug addiction, references to past abuse, some misogyny, and explicit sexual content. Quick note on the representation, as I said, Viola is a trans woman who passes, and Gracewood is a former soldier disabled by the war. He sustained a leg injury that requires him to use a mobility aid. He experiences chronic pain, and he's also dealing with some related drug dependency. This book destroyed me. It absolutely eviscerated my feelings. I read this book several weeks ago at this point, and I will still yell, cry, or both just thinking about it and thinking about certain scenes. Also, I didn't really put this together until afterwards, but this story is kind of a very loose recontextualizing of Beauty and the Beast, with this sullen, heartbroken rich man transformed by grief, locked away in his manor, who only softens with the appearance of his true love. I want to be clear, it is not a retelling, but there are connections. Even on the cover, he's wearing the blue suit, she's wearing the yellow gown. I'm just saying, this historical romance gave me joy, gave me life, gave me purpose. It is an incredibly tender, slow burn romance that is the absolute epitome of queer yearning, and it is the ultimate second chance romance. There is no greater second chance than basically coming back from the dead. This romance makes me so soft. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to talk about it properly. I think what really makes this romance so striking is the fact that being together allows both Gracewood and Viola to process their grief, and they're both grieving completely different things. For Viola, she's grieving both the person she was wrongfully raised to be, along with the womanhood she was never fully invited or allowed to embrace. And Gracewood is not only coming to terms with the fact that he was grieving someone who was never actually lost, but he's also grieving the past version of himself that was stronger, more independent, more able-bodied, because the world has taught him to place value in those things. They're both haunted by these past versions of themselves, and they're still learning how to accept themselves for who they are now in many ways, even if those new versions of themselves come with obstacles or hardships. And there is so much nuance and so much care that's put into how Gracewood and the other characters process Viola's transness. Does that mean everyone automatically understands it and accepts it? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that Viola gets the chance to express herself and her feelings and her needs in a way that's very thoughtful and direct. I also appreciate how this romance doesn't shy away from how Viola's womanhood inherently changes the dynamic of her friendship with Gracewood, specifically in how they carry themselves in society and how they have to take different rules of propriety into account. There's all these different rules for how they conduct themselves as people of two different genders, and that's not inherently a bad thing, but it is new and different. The story is also very mindful of how Viola is still learning how to navigate those new spaces as well, how she still doesn't really know what she should wear, how she should carry herself, what's polite for her to say, or even how to take up womanly activities like arts and tea service and being a hostess. What's more, the banter and the dialogue in this book is just top notch. Alexis Hall was born to write Regency-era banter, and he knows exactly the right words for his romantic leads to say that will absolutely tear your heart asunder. I was telling some friends about this, but there's a line where Gracewood is remembering his best friend with Viola, still not knowing who she is, and she says, "This friend sounds like he was a really good influence," to which Gracewood looks at her and replies, "He was the joy of my life." You can't just... Sorry. You can't just say things like that and not expect me to immediately and violently fall deep into my emotions. And every interaction between them is just like that, is at that same level, has one or more lines that hit just as hard, if not harder than that, and it is simply unfair to every other romance book in existence. And also that aspect of Gracewood unknowingly grieving with the very same person who unintentionally caused that grief in the first place is a romantic dynamic I never knew I needed in my life, but it is so freaking delicious. It is so good and so cathartic to see these characters find their way back to each other and heal each other in a way that's so incredibly earnest. I have to cut myself off there because I physically cannot talk about this book anymore. It's heartfelt, it's funny, it's deeply romantic, it's the queer historical romance of my dreams, and I cherish every single second I spent with this perfect story. I gave it a huge 5 stars. After that, I read my arc of I Kiss Shara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. By the time you're watching this book recently came out on May 3rd from Wednesday Books. It's a queer contemporary story about Chloe, who's one of the only openly queer kids at her conservative Southern Christian school, and she basically tries to rub the administration's face in it by being academically perfect and getting the highest grades. With graduation coming up, her biggest competition for valedictorian is Shara Wheeler, the town darling who everyone knows and loves and wants to be, and right before prom, Shara kisses 3 people, including Chloe, before she mysteriously disappears. There's no explanation as to where she went or why she left, but Chloe realizes that she and those other 2 people are the last ones who really saw Shara and who know her well enough to figure out where she went. And sure enough, they begin to slowly discover some very deliberately left clues. Content warnings for some explorations of homophobia, racism, misogyny, religious bigotry, and religious trauma, some mentions of outing, and some instances of underage drinking. I had a good time reading this. The setup is super interesting and fun, and it very easily lends itself to a fast pace. Casey, of course, is also great at creating distinctive supporting characters who threaten to steal the show, and they're also just a master of crafting voice. I also really appreciate how all of Casey's books are completely different from each other, not only in genre and concept, but also in tone and theme, and I think that really exemplifies their incredible range. This book, for example, is more of a straightforward contemporary story that sets out to really examine the setting, which is a deeply conservative religious southern town, and how that specific place has very differently shaped all the characters. That, to me, is the endgame of this story, to show how none of these characters are unaffected by religious trauma, even if they're earnestly devout. Just because that perspective is so inherently pervasive in everything they do and everywhere they go, it's not possible for them to be untouched by that experience. So I think Chloe starts out feeling like she's very much the lone lesbian at school, that she's the only person woke to the ever-present tension between social issues and religious issues, and she feels like anyone who doesn't respond or think the same way she does is then part of the problem. But what the story is actually doing is painstakingly revealing through this collective hunt for Shara Wheeler how Chloe and her classmates are so much more alike than she thinks. They just have different ways of processing and responding to these same experiences. For Chloe, the way she shows up in the world is to be aggressively out and proud, to be the token lesbian, very in your face. She wants to live in a way that forces people to confront their discomfort on a daily basis. And that's totally valid for who she is and where she is in life, but not everyone is going to land in the same place. On the flip side, you have someone like Shara, who responds to her own intersection of queerness and religious trauma by making herself lovable and perfect, because she thinks if you can't make people accept you, at least they can hold you in high enough esteem that rejection is not an option. And speaking of Shara, I think that Casey McQuiston made a really hard job for themselves in playing with that manic pixie dream girl trope, because the manic pixie dream girl is often unknowable and emotionally distant. But I think by the end of this story, Shara definitely feels like a real person, and I also think there's something to be said about how the trope of the manic pixie dream girl is often defined and characterized by the male gaze, which is not centered in this narrative. In this story, that gaze is feminized and queered. It's a gaze, G-A-Y-Z-E, which makes the dynamic inherently different. Casey really plays with the queer power dynamic of the mysterious girl wanting to be chased. What if the clues she left behind were actually love letters? What if it's actually incredibly gay that Shara has fabricated all these opportunities for Chloe to actively think about her and wonder what she's doing and where she is? There's like a queer yearning that's constantly underlying every aspect of this mystery as it unfolds, and I think that's what makes it really interesting. So overall for me, this was pretty solid. The mystery element was compelling, the twists were interesting, the characters were super memorable and fun, and like Casey's other books, it's a story that you just don't want to stop reading. I will say that I wasn't as invested in this couple as I have been with other couples that Casey has written in the past. Like with this one, I was like, if they end up together, that's cool. If they don't, I'm not gonna lose sleep over it, but it was still good, so take that as you will. In the end, I gave this 4 stars. Then for Tome Topple, I read The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, read by Shiromi Aserio. This is the first book in Tasha Suri's new epic fantasy trilogy. It is inspired by the history and epics of India, and it is also sapphic. The story follows a captive princess named Malini, whose traitorous brother has banished her and imprisoned her in this ancient ruined temple far from the palace. Various palace attendants have to make the perilous journey to this temple on a regular basis in order to clean her chambers and bring her supplies, and Priya is just one of those many maidservants. She actually enjoys blending in with the other servants because she is hiding a dark and dangerous forbidden magic. However, when Malini accidentally witnesses Priya's true nature, she realizes that this maidservant may be powerful enough to help her escape, and the two begin to work together to try and dismantle this corrupt empire from the inside. Content warnings for references to massacre, death, human sacrifice, and execution, some explorations of a magical plague, misogyny, instances of gore, blood, physical assault, graphic violence, and graphic injury, references to past abuse and trauma, and brief references to suicide ideation and attempts. What's most notable about this story, I think, is that it's a very distinctly Indian-based story that also unapologetically centers powerful and power-seeking women who do not have to sacrifice or compromise those desires. If we're thinking about Indian-based mythology or folklore, for instance, there are numerous examples of women who are thematically punished or held up as cautionary tales for overstepping their place or just making mistakes. And that phenomenon is not unique to Indian folklore by any means. It's something we see across cultures when men are the ones telling and retelling the stories that get passed down across generations. But it is notable, and the purposeful disruption of that narrative in this story is a really incredible reclamation of what it means to be a powerful Indian woman. Much like Tasha Suri's previous duology, this series is also doing a lot of compelling work in exploring the inherent tension underscoring the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, which is oftentimes inextricable from each other and also from the way society functions. I don't know if I would personally classify this as an enemies to lovers dynamic, but Malini and Priya are definitely from 2 different worlds, and they're bumping up against a lot of really complex sticking points the more time they spend together, and that expands their respective worldviews as a result. Again, this series also has a lot of interesting things to say about cycles of violence and how we might break away from systemic injustice. Is it better to seize control over the system currently in place, to destroy it and build something new, or are there possibly other choices? As you might guess from the page count, it's a bit of a slow boil. I did question the pacing a few times, not gonna lie, but I still think the payoff was well worth it, and it really sets up something exciting for book 2, which I cannot wait to read. I gave this 4.5 stars. And coming in clutch at the 11th hour, I did get to read my Patreon pick for April, which was The Last Cuentista by Dana Barba Higuera. This is a middle-grade Latinx sci-fi story that takes place in the distant future where it's been foretold that Earth will be destroyed by a comet, and only a few hundred scientists and their families have been chosen to journey to a new planet to carry on the human race. Our main character, Petra, is one of the few lucky ones, and after about a 300-year journey, she wakes up to this new planet and finds out that something has gone horribly wrong in the process. Turns out there's this sinister collective that's been systematically erasing everyone's memories of the past, and there was some kind of malfunction in Petra's pod that made the process fail, and now she is the only person on board who remembers Earth and all of its stories. So now it's up to her to figure out what to do and see if she can use those stories to not only bring people back to themselves, but also help them find the strength to fight back against this sinister force. Content warnings for death, parental death, and grief, experienced ableism, brief instances of vomit, and some thematic violence. I'm so thankful my patrons picked this book for me to read because I've been wanting to read it for so long and it did not disappoint. I'm still processing the story, but I truly think it accomplishes so much. First of all, I think there's something to be said about how this book is very much in the same tradition as stories like The Deep or Each of Us a Desert, where the central concept is about this lone story keeper and how isolating and burdensome that position can feel at times. I will say that the other two books I just mentioned are focusing more on the kind of toll that burden can take and how the main character can free themselves and reclaim their agency, and while this story definitely explores a similar concept, it's more about reveling in the possibility of creation itself. While it's absolutely overwhelming and intimidating for Petra to realize she is the sole keeper of all human memory, she is more so thinking about how she can use the knowledge she has about Earth and combine that with her love of storytelling to bring people back to themselves. And there's also a celebration of creativity because you see how Petra's storytelling has been influenced by her abuela and her ancestors, but also how those ancestors are empowering her to not tell the same stories the same way they did, because she has to find a way of storytelling that meets the moment. So that's really powerful because you see her contemplating what she remembers and what she was taught and then actively making decisions that will forever change those narratives because she has to find a version of the story that makes sense for people who don't have that foundational context. So really the story is all about the beauty, the power, and the value of potential and change. And also, just on a surface level, I love that this story is inherently a Latina sci-fi story, because reading it made me realize that we don't have a ton of stories about Latina people in space, stories where the protagonist's Latina identity is central to what they're doing in space, and I'm really glad this book exists. The fact of the matter is that we deserve to exist and take up space in every possible timeline and place, real, imagined, or impossibly distant. In conclusion, this book was exciting, terrifying, surprising, and deeply emotional. I'm once again impressed by the range of Dana Barbara Higuera's work. For her to write Lupe Wong Won't Dance and then this story and to have them both be equally phenomenal is a tremendous feat. I cherish this and I give it 4.5 stars. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read in April. As I've been saying every single month, I am still taking part in Pondathon 2, details down below, and this is what my garden looked like in January, in February, in March, and now in April, and I'm really pleased with how it's going so far. You know the drill. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, let me know what you think in the comments down below, or let me know what was your favorite book that you read in April. But that is everything I had to share with you for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.